Our first ever Supreme Court driven emergency pod. Oren Cass, the founder and chief economist of American Compass, and Peter Harrell, host of the Security Economics podcast, and as of a month ago, a Georgetown Law scholar, join to discuss. Oren, why don't you kick us off?
I just love the case as like a legal matter. I think there are obviously partisans on both sides who will tell you this is a clean cut, decision X or decision Y. I think there are actually a lot of very close legal questions, and it's fascinating how many there are. I think the reality is that almost surely what we are going to get as a result is a decision that attempts to put down some long-term markers for how the court thinks about these questions, while on the specifics of the tariffs, essentially trying to stall, probably give a bunch of new sort of guidelines and principles, and then remand back to a lower court to figure out how it should implement those. It's a little bit what you saw them do with the presidential immunity question. And so the result will be everyone will have a better sense of how the court would initially decide this, but there will be more time before anything's actually resolved. And in the interim, the administration will have to go figure out what it wants to move on through other authorities, what it wants to keep fighting on, what, if anything, it wants to legislate. And anyone who's looking for a clear-cut and decisive victory or devastating loss, I think will almost surely be disappointed.
Peter.
Yeah, I might disagree a bit with you, Oren, on that. I think I heard a majority of the court skeptical that IEPA authorizes at least all of the tariffs that Trump has imposed under IEPA. And so, well, I think we could see a decision that holds, some IEPA tariffs are authorized, that and then kick to kind of the lower courts to sort out exactly what the parameters of those are. I do think we are, more likely than not to find that at least the quote unquote universal and reciprocal tariffs, the sort of 20% on Vietnam, 15% on the European Union, 19% on Thailand, those kinds of tariffs are not authorized under IEPA. You could be wrong on that, but I heard a fair amount of skepticism from the Chief Justice and from Justice Comey Barrett, and even from Justice Gorsuch on the extent of the tariffs. Now, to your broader point, so even if the court does strike down a decent chunk of the IEPA tariffs, as Ambassador Greer, as other administration officials have said, they have fallback options. So I think we will see the administration, work through other authorities to put back together some of the tariffs. I do agree with you. I think we are going to get a decision. The decision may be kind of like, in some sense, narrow. It'll be about what this statute, what this 1977 emergency power statute says. But I do also think we will get, some broader discourse in the opinion about, how the Supreme Court thinks about its major questions doctrine, about kind of executive power versus congressional power generally. So I do think this is a decision that, students and lawyers will be reading for some time to come, because it will have broader ramifications, not beyond just the sort of particular case on tariffs that the court was hearing yesterday.
Well, this is kind of the weird wrinkle of all of this is like if you didn't literally have Liberation Day, but you just spent a few more months writing some Section 232s or just like having ChatGPT write the Section 232 findings, then the standing for the Supreme Court to jump in and say you can't do this like would have been much smaller than the route that the Trump administration ended up choosing and put here today. Or am I wrong on that?
So, I mean, we're, of course, all of us who sort of think about trade law are now unpacking these other statutes and thinking about, well, what could he do under these other statutes and what are the limits of these other statutes? And I guess, like, sort of for your audience, Jordan, not necessarily deep in the weeds here, just to step back. So we are, the tariffs at issue in this case are the IEPA tariffs. So that's universal and reciprocal tariffs. That's the fentanyl tariffs, quote unquote, on Mexico, China, and Canada. It is also the tariffs on India over India's oil import purchases. And it's the tariffs on Brazil over the issues with Bolsonaro, former President Bolsonaro, down there. It is not the product tariffs, right? We are not talking about the steel and aluminum tariffs. We are not talking about the car tariffs here and those sorts of things. I think if you look, Oren, you guys may have an economic estimate. When I look at sort of like Yale Budget Lab and others, it's probably like 70% economically or so of the tariffs that Trump has imposed this term are at issue here. So that's what we're talking about. The reason I think Trump has used this statute is twofold. If you look at his alternatives, first of all, as you suggest, Jordan, the alternatives all require process. Trump has done a bunch of 232s. He's done them on cars. He's done them on steel and aluminum. But as we are seeing with the fact that for 6 or 8 months now, he has had a 232 on semiconductors that he has not yet completed. Like, these things take time. And Trump is not known as somebody who has a lot of patience when it comes to trade policy, who wants to really, see his administration wait months and months before they can put tariffs in place. So there's a time and fact-finding kind of element that IEPA has let him avoid that he would have to do it with these other statutes. The other thing is, as you really unpack these other statutes, I do think he will find some substantive constraints on them. Now, a lot of these statutes haven't been litigated all that much, and, we'll sort of see what the substantive constraints emerge. But, for example, 301. 301 is a statute that he used to impose tariffs on China during his first term, something I very strongly agreed with him that he was correct to do. And arguably has some substantive limits in terms of the quantity of tariffs having to be in some degree tied to an unfair trade practice by the foreign country, which China, very, very easy, right? I think you could justify even much higher tariffs on China on unfair trade practices. But, if you wanted to maintain, I don't know, let's pick one, like a 10% tariff on Australia, a country that actually we have a trade surplus with. We export more to Australia than vice versa. Is there some unfair Australian trade practice that merits a 10% tariff? I don't know. I'm not the expert there in what Australia does. You might be able to find, maybe they're regulating our big tech companies. Maybe you can find something. But I do think that there will be on, some economies, he would find some substantive constraints. So as I think about it, if he's not going to go back to Congress, if he loses and he decides not to go back to Congress, I think he can recreate more than 50% of the tariffs. But I don't think it's 100%, even after he jumps through all of the hoops that these other statutes require.
I agree with Peter. I think the sort of universal global tariff is the piece that is sort of hardest to do, either justified under IEPA or through a 301 or, obviously certainly a 232, and is probably the piece where you're most likely to need legislation if you actually want it to be a permanent part of policy. The irony to some extent is that the stuff that people are most frustrated with Trump over, the stuff that seem most sort of unsubstantiated, like, oh, we don't like the ad that Canada ran, so here's another 10% on Canada, are in a lot of respects actually the stuff that is most defensible under IEPA or under a sort of executive authority, where the premise is, look, we're negotiating here. We are using tariffs quite explicitly as a tool of foreign policy to try to strengthen our hand in negotiations. You could not possibly do that through legislation. You couldn't go back to Congress in the middle of a negotiation and say, hey, now we want you to do X instead of Y because that's what we threatened at the table yesterday. And so this is where, I think I agree very much with Peter that at the end of the day, within everything that has happened under IEPA, there are actually just a lot of different rationales, a lot of different legal implications. And that's where I maybe we disagree a little bit. I think it's very likely that the court's take is going to be to try to draw out those strands and then send it back for somebody else to figure out. I think it's very unlikely that you would have the Supreme Court simultaneously sort of de novo try to distinguish all of these different things, and that also what would at some point become new findings of fact you would need to then implement that. And so that's where I think you'll see the administration ultimately get some breathing room. But then also, in terms of what is U.S. trade policy going to be for the next decade, probably and hopefully need to start laying down something more permanent than an emergency power.
Before we look forward, Peter, I'm curious to what extent, like, the specter of the fentanyl tariffs being taken off potentially impacted the negotiations between Xi and Trump and APEC.
You see, I actually don't think that the specter of Trump losing tariffs in court has that much of a meaningful impact on the China negotiations. I'm actually not sure it has that much of a meaningful impact on any of the negotiations, but China in particular, because there is an existing 301 on China, because there are other 301s that are under investigation. There's an existing 301 from Trump's first term. There's also an existing 301 on China on Chinese shipbuilding. Actually, China is the country he could most quickly and most easily pivot to these other dials to reimpose the tariffs. I actually think, so I think it has almost no relevance to the China negotiations. I think it has only limited relevance to some of the other negotiations, because, like, when I talk to European officials, when I talk to Japanese officials, they all are watching this court case with great interest, but they also understand that Trump could recreate, at least a portion of these tariffs under other authorities. And so they have kind of a pragmatic view of, well, if Trump loses this, he can recreate some of it under other authorities. So, like, why would we piss him off by, provocatively walking away from the trade deals we've just signed? Like, that doesn't mean I think that if he loses in court, you might see the European Union, like, move more slowly to implement some of its commitments under the trade deal while Trump figures out his next steps. But I don't think you'd see a lot of walking away. One final point before, and then I want to ask Oren a question. I do think we would have seen a pretty different case yesterday if, like, a much narrower set of tariffs had been on the table. If the tariffs that we were really talking about yesterday had been just the tariffs on India for India's purchases of Russian oil, something we've long used IEPA sanctions to deal with, I think you would have seen a very different tone yesterday. But of course, the justices are looking at this. This isn't just like a narrow, tariff that's over a specific geopolitical factor. This is over a whole panoply of tariffs, and that is that then framed the skepticism that I think we heard yesterday in many ways that we wouldn't have heard if Trump had in fact used this more judiciously. The question, Warren, I wanted to ask you, sort of looking forward, is about Congress, because, like, the sort of small c constitutionalist in me thinks if we're going to have a reform in global trade policy, in U.S. trade policy as big as the one we are currently undertaking, well, that is, like, fundamentally a congressional prerogative, right? Constitutionally, it is a congressional prerogative, and thinks, well, for this sort of thing, you should go to Congress and get legislative change. I'm also a realist, having dealt with Congress for many years, of all the challenges of getting Congress to do anything. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about, do you think there would be a path now in Congress or over a year and a half to, like, getting Congress on board with changes in major changes in U.S. trade policy? Or do you think we're just, practically speaking, not there?
I think there's definitely a path forward. And I think I always come to the tariff policy question in dividing to three camps. I think you've got the kind of global tariff question. you've got all of these reciprocal tariffs and negotiations with allies, and then you've got China. I think all of the sort of reciprocal stuff going on, trying to strike new deals, ultimately, do you get like a USMCA that needs to go to Congress? Maybe. I don't know how or what it would look like to legislate that piece of it. And so that's why I say I'm most sympathetic to figuring out, how the president has the authority to conduct what does feel more like foreign relations to me. When it comes to the global tariff, when it comes to China, I think there is a path to move in Congress, and I think it is what we need if you're going to have a stable new expectation domestically, globally, of what U.S. trade policy is. There is some, not a lot, of bipartisan support for some sort of global tariff. If you didn't have the incredible polarization of Trump on top of things, you could certainly see a world where Democrats would be at least as enthusiastic as Republicans about doing something here. And then when it comes to China, I think there's definitely support. I mean, the main move would be to repeal permanent normal trade relations, and that's where you have very substantive and I think promising legislation with lots of co-sponsors. If you made a political push on that, it's hard to envision who exactly these days would be fighting to maintain permanent normal trade relations with China. So I think those are the two places the administration should focus. And I think there's some potential that they could or would. I think ultimately, to your point, it comes down to, can anything move through Congress? Because flip side is, I think you have to be sympathetic to some extent to an administration saying, well, if we can't even fund the government, it's hard to envision getting a big bipartisan win for the president on elements of the trade stuff.
Um, so to what extent does, like, we talked, you mentioned earlier, like Australia should be the most excited about this ruling. It's not really China. Oren, you have this vision of a grand strategy of reciprocity, which we'll get to perhaps now, but I'm curious, to what extent could a Supreme Court ruling sort of like back the president into the type of global trade relations that you'd actually be more excited about?
I don't know that a Supreme Court ruling could have that effect. I think in a world where you get the kind of ruling I think is most likely, that kind of signals to the administration you have a little bit more time here, but you do need a different plan. That's probably the best prospect to then see a focus on moving in Congress, which I think would be useful. But in terms of what the overall strategy is, I think that's where, to some extent, we're still waiting for and still really need the clarity from the administration, mostly from Trump himself, on what he wants, where this is all going. Is the goal here to get a big deal with China, or is there a recognition that there isn't really a deal to be had? We're right at the point now where, what is a renegotiated USMCA going to look like is very much in focus. I see that as kind of the linchpin of whatever we're building. USMCA, as it is structured and agreed to, will be the template. What do we actually want from USMCA? I think it's totally independent of what the Supreme Court's doing to say the administration needs to articulate that very clearly if we're going to not just demolish the old system that I think needed demolishing, but now actually be building something better.
So I very much agree with you, Oren, that like USMCA, and we are now, as you say, getting, we are right now, like comments have been due to USTR earlier this week, I think, on what sort of stakeholders want out of USMCA. And I think this is going to be, if the Trump administration is going to succeed in, over the next 3 years, building a new order as opposed to just, putting the final nails in the coffin of the old order. I do think this is absolutely the linchpin. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. Not least that, these are the trading relationships where we have by far the most leverage. I believe we import 80%, like all of Mexico's exports, we import 80% of them, right? I mean, these are wildly asymmetric trading relationships in terms of our leverage. And so if you actually, just from a kind of tactical negotiating perspective, putting aside all the strategic interests we have in North America, and I think we have very significant strategic interests all around, this is kind of the opportunity we have from a tactical negotiating perspective to really negotiate something very new and very interesting. And I certainly hope that the Trump administration takes advantage of it. I mean, I was actually already quite interested in the, last week or 2 weeks ago, we got, the first sort of actual deal text of what some of the USTR might be thinking from some of its trade deals. We got the Cambodia and the Malaysia deal text, and there's actually a lot of interesting provisions in there to unpack. I give the administration quite a bit of credit for some of the details that they put in those deals. But we can actually make those much real and make them deeper in the USMCA context. Like, that is where we can really start the process of building a new order.
You want to highlight some of them, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, well, we can start with just the China-focused provisions of those of the Malaysia and the Cambodia deals, and I will say a lot of it is like sort of will need to be implemented. We have to see all those sort of caveats. But let's start with what the promising parts of them are. I mean, you saw both Cambodia and Malaysia agree that if the U.S. raises a tariff barrier or a non-tariff barrier, like a restriction on potentially like Chinese telecommunications equipment, if we raise a barrier, we can notify Cambodia and Malaysia, and they have committed to taking comparable action under domestic law. Like, that's actually if that is followed through and done on that, that's a huge win for the United States. They also, was interesting in Malaysia, so one of the things the Trump administration, I think all of us are sort of worried about, is what Chinese companies are doing in third countries. Are they setting up factories in Malaysia and then from Malaysia dumping products into the U.S. market? Malaysia and Cambodia committed that if we raise concerns with them about the actions of Chinese companies in their markets that are then impacting our market, those countries would take action. Malaysia and Cambodia would take action. Both countries also committed to, set up an investment screening law. So like, these are commitments. We have to see implementation. There's a lot from between writing a commitment down in a couple of paragraphs on paper and actually implementing it. But I think there were some very promising signs coming out of those deals.
I wanted to jump in just on the USMCA point quickly. I agree exactly with what Peter was just saying about these other deals, both that they're very interesting and, to some extent, how robustly you can implement those sorts of commitments with Cambodia remains to be seen. Those kinds of commitments in a USMCA, though, become a total sea change in the way that trade policy is conducted globally. And so I think, in my mind, what's so important about USMCA is, one, to Peter's point, it's where we have the most leverage, right? At the end of the day, I think we should treat Mexico and Canada well and respectfully and as equal partners, but they don't really have other options. And so that creates a unique opportunity for the U.S. to sort of lay out and define what it wants. Because of the history going all the way back to NAFTA, there is a capacity to robustly implement and enforce in a way that will become proof of concept for this stuff actually happening beyond just being on paper. And then I think the third thing that's really important for the U.S. about USMCA is that if we get it done, if we get it successfully structured in a way we want, it then becomes a fallback for us relative to all the other negotiations. And this is, what some folks in Washington are now calling Fortress North America. I think it's fair to say, like, look, if the U.S. were truly going it alone out there, you could have real concerns. Is that a viable path forward for the U.S.? If the U.S. is going with a USMCA, with the size of that full market, with the security commitments, with the diversification that Mexico and Canada do bring to an open market, at that point, the U.S. can really credibly say, even to a Japan, even to an EU, look, here are the USMCA-like terms. We would love to have you in our trading bloc. If you're not up for that, if you are insisting on remaining open to China, if you're not willing to commit to bringing greater balance to trade, then good luck to you, because we actually have something better than continuing to work with you in the way you have been working. And so I think the other reason USMCA, and this goes all the way back to, why was the Trump administration going after Mexico and Canada so aggressively? I mean, even in February, even before we got to Liberation Day, I think it's because if we can get this right, the U.S. then has the foundation to build from that, again, not the first best ideal we should be aiming for, but an improvement on what the prior system has been, and a credible fallback for any of the other negotiations that are taking place.
Peter, how credible is Fortress America? I don't know. The trade side of the Donroe Doctrine, I guess.
I actually think this could be pretty credible. And I do also think it creates, as Oren says, it creates this kind of potential gravitational pull that then gives us more leverage in our trade negotiations, elsewhere. So I think this is pretty credible. It will require, complicated, tough negotiations, and it will also require sort of disciplined and a sustained focus on this issue over 6 or 9 months, which has not always been the president's strong suit in negotiations. But I do know that at the very least, his trade team, I mean, particularly Ambassador Greer, but also I think Secretary Lutnick, see this, and so I do think I am optimistic that we are going to see a very interesting deal come out of this. We are going to see a bit of a attractive fortress that other folks will start wanting to join, starting in the back end of next year. So, Oren, I really enjoyed your recent piece in Foreign Affairs, where you argue for a grand strategy of reciprocity. And the way I read your piece, you kind of are arguing there should be 3 core elements to a trading bloc. There should be kind of commitments by everybody that we're going to take care of our own security. There should be commitments to balanced trade, and then there should be commitments to getting China out of our operating system. I just wonder if you could unpack kind of how you're thinking about this, and also how feasible you think it is as a strategy.
Well, I think it's certainly feasible, given just what we were just talking about, the steps we're already taking in this direction. I think we are seeing in these negotiations with countries that should be and hopefully will be U.S. allies, on all 3 fronts, an acknowledgement that this makes sense. Not that it's easy, but it is a starting point for other countries to acknowledge. The U.S. has a legitimate concern about balanced trade, and frankly, at this point, these other countries do as well. The funny thing about a Germany or a Japan that has been the flip side of a lot of these imbalances, at least once you put China to the side, is that their economies are to an extent suffering from it as well. As much as it has been a problem for the U.S. To be deindustrializing, I think it has been a problem for Germany and Japan to be suppressing domestic consumption and relying so much on exporting. And so I think there's a potentially mutual benefit in moving to a more balanced model. I think likewise, then when you think about China, everybody enjoys the short-term sugar high of the cheap stuff from China, but I think everybody also recognizes the long-term danger. And one of the really interesting effects of the way that the U.S. has started to confront China is it heightens that pressure on everybody else. I mean, people are like, well, why didn't the U.S. just sort of get together with allies and all agree to confront China together? And the answer is because no one else would have been willing to do that. I mean, that is, in a sense, been what the Biden administration tried to do for 4 years. And the answer is, asking nicely just doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, so it's not that we didn't talk about it. We certainly talked about it.
Right. This is yeah, wow, really, I guess just no one ever thought of this idea that Western democracies should get together and, do something about China. no duh. Obviously, that would have been great. And the reality is that for, many of the same reasons the US political system refused to address it for so long, other market democracies have had a real problem doing anything about it. And cajoling just did not get where we needed to go. And, I think credit to Trump when you actually say, fine, watch this. Not only do you prove you can do it, and obviously this is not free, there are costs, but also obviously it has not destroyed the US economy to have very high tariffs on China, to be starting to drive a real decoupling. Um, all of those surpluses then start to backwash instead into the EU. And you now have the EU facing a much sharper choice than they were before. Now, what they decide we could come back to, that'll be an interesting question, but at least they're really put to the choice now in a way that they were trying to avoid. And so, I think you see, we were just talking about these model agreements, even with a Cambodia or a Malaysia. Certainly you've seen Mexico take very seriously the need to confront China more directly. Canada is busy on its quasi-Euro-liberal fainting couch about all of this, but at some point they will get serious as well. And so I think that side of it, again, it is not free. It's painful and costly in various ways, but it is something that is in the mutual interest of all of these countries. And then the third piece, when you get to security, I guess now I'm just repeating myself. It's the same story, right? It's just cajoling and saying, hey, guys, wouldn't it be great if you actually took your own security seriously is not a novel concept. We tried that for a very long time, and it simply did not work. What you are now seeing within the Trump framework is much more serious commitments in Europe, in Japan, to actually taking responsibility for security in their regions. And a realization that is, again, good for them. It's expensive, but it would be a lot better if Japan and Korea and Australia could be the ones that credibly deterred China in Taiwan. And plus, heaven forbid Taiwan actually spend itself. Instead of everyone looking over their shoulder with this sort of have I done enough of my homework to go out and play? Have I eaten enough of my dinner to get to dessert? And then obviously the same thing with particularly Germany, but the EU more broadly. If they want to deter Russia and be secure in Europe, the way to do that would be to deter Russia and be secure in Europe. And so by putting them to these choices, it's understandable why they're sulking. It's understandable why they're frustrated. It's understandable why they don't like the costs. But if you actually sort of step back and look at it from a sort of neutral, aliens from Mars perspective, it all actually makes a lot of sense, I think.
So, Peter, or I guess everyone. So last night I did a show with Jake Sullivan, and this was, not surprisingly, a theme is how hard could you have pushed the allies? The one hypothetical that he did sort of deeply entertain was the one where you just do FDPR on the semiconductor export equipment and say, sorry, Korea, sorry, Japan, sorry, Netherlands, we're the hegemon, deal with it. I'm curious, Peter, for your reflections on this. My hypothesis was just that Biden went into office with the central thesis being we need to repair our alliances. And if that is kind of your baseline overarching or one of your core principles, then doing the thing that the great line that Oren had in his piece, when it came to allies and partners, the United States would say do this and stop that, but rarely said or else. Your or else credibility just isn't really there.
So I look, I think, as you say, Jordan, President Biden himself, and I think it was in many ways coming from the president, he was very alliance focused. He really, going back to his days in the Senate and as vice president, really believes, going back to his memories of the Cold War, I think, really believes in the idea of alliances, in the idea of what you might think of as kind of cooperative games rather than confrontational games. So really coming from the president was a clear directive of we should focus on working things out and, kind of cajoling and inducement oriented cooperation on China versus as opposed to with our allies, inducement and cajoling oriented, getting cooperation with allies on China as opposed to a kind of a threat heavy approach. And I do think one of the lessons of the Trump era that we should as a country be taking seriously is, sometimes you need to be prepared to deliver a firmer or else message. And I think that is a really important takeaway. But I actually think there's another, if I'm going to offer a critique of the Biden administration's trade policy, I actually think the deeper critique of the Biden administration trade policy is that although it had a clearly thought through geopolitical logic, let's get our allies and partners on board, right? That was the geopolitical. I actually think the Biden administration did not have a clearly thought through economic logic of what it wanted out of trade policy, right? Like it just was too internally torn about, are we now in an era where from our own economic self-interest, we actually want higher tariffs because we're trying to onshore manufacturing to the United States? Or are we still in some version, kind of economically, at least among allies and partners, of a kind of neoliberal world order where actually it's, very low barriers among allies and partners? And so I think what you saw was an effort at a trade policy purely through the lens of geopolitics and not through the lens of economics. And I just posit that's never going to work, right? Trade policy has to be about your economic vision. What do you want economically as a country out of this, and not just geopolitically? And I think that was actually the more foundational, like if I'm thinking trade policy as opposed to China, that was the more foundational challenge. I do agree that when it comes to China, there is a clear lesson we should have been prepared to be a little bit more stick heavy.
Yeah, although actually, Pierre, I'm curious about this. So I totally agree with you with the characterization of the Biden administration. I might on kind of the economic side, it seems to me less that they were unclear than that it was a sort of house divided against itself. I mean, I think Ambassador Tai had a very clear economic perspective, but Secretary Yellen probably had a very clear opposite economic perspective, and I'm not sure that was ever resolved. For me, the China question is really interesting, though, because, at the end of the day, I look at sort of, Jake Sullivan's small yard, high fence formulation, of which the first half is small yard. Like, it seems to me that actually even toward China, the view was that, that was going to be viewed solely through a geopolitical lens. And there was this kind of very small set of national security concerns to be narrowed as far as possible to ensure that a hypothetical, broader, constructive relationship could still flourish. Obviously, I mean, I think that is exactly wrong, but I'm as what we should do. I'm curious if you think that's fair to say that's where the administration was, or kind of how you think small yard, high fence translates as a China policy.
So two responses to that. So first, Oren, I agree when I say that the Biden administration, I thought, did not have a coherent kind of economic theory of the case on what it wanted out of trade policy. I very much agree. That was probably, the result of many diverse views in the administration that were never reconciled, and not that, there was no, one person did not have a coherent view. It was, I think, as you say, a problem of kind of getting to coherence among divergent views. On the question about China, it's interesting because I think on the one hand, many of the senior officials in the Biden administration, including the president himself, bought into this conceptual frame of a small yard of restrictions with a high fence. But as you say, most trade, most relations would be allowed to continue. I do think the administration both was internally divided and never kind of got to a coherent perspective on, how wide is that yard? Is it here? Is it something wider? I remember once I was in Europe, and a friend of mine who works in Europe showed me his phone. He said, "Oh, here's a meme that's going around about Jake Sullivan's speech," and it was a photo of a European chateau surrounded by acres and acres and acres of lawn, and there was like meme language. This is Jake Sullivan's yard, So like there are certainly views about how wide the yard was. But I think Jake, to his credit, actually did have a view that it should be narrow. I think other people thought it should be wider. I think that this is one of the fundamental questions we as a country kind of coherently need to resolve. Is like, do we think we should have a 20% decoupling with China, 20% of trade only in select areas gets kind of walled off? Should we have a 50% decoupling where it's kind of stuff that isn't furniture and printed goods, and that's, or do we have an 80 or 90% decoupling? Like, to me, like, we need to have a start with the, like, what do we think the end state should be here? And then build from that. I personally am in favor of a fairly broad decoupling. Like, I don't mind sort of, well, there may be trade policy reasons, dumping and whatnot, but, from a national security perspective, I actually don't worry too much about, furniture and shoes and garments and that kind of thing. Yeah, maybe trade policy. But I do think we should have a pretty broad decoupling from China because I think it is in our strategic interest to do so. I also think over time, it might actually provide some strategic stability to the U.S.-China relationship to be more decoupled, because we wouldn't have these ongoing blowups and concerns about rare earths and things like that. Like, we could have a less economically dependent relationship where we could then talk about strategic issues and maintaining sort of strategic geopolitical stability. Yeah. But that is not, I think, in my party, in the Democratic, or certainly not in the Biden administration, I think there was not a view that we should be like 60% decoupled. I think it was sincerely something much narrower.
Yeah, no,
but I'm curious what you think Trump is. Like, we have the big deal. Like, it's unclear to me where Trump is on this, frankly. Oren.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I want to say. I just wanted to pick up quickly. I appreciate you making that point about this is actually potentially a more stable relationship, because I think that's super important. And one thing that drives me most nuts in these conversations is this, like, fine, people tell me you shouldn't use the term midwit, but I think it's the the appropriate descriptive term for the kind of like, well, like I read it in a column somewhere idea that, countries with, that trade with each other don't go to war. And if we sort of disrupt our trade relationship, doesn't that, ensure World War III or whatever? Just like, I honestly don't know where this came from. I mean, we had 2 world wars break out among countries that were like literally bordering each other and closely economically intertwined. And then we had a 50-year Cold War where we agreed to have 2 systems that were mostly separate. And that was a far more stable arrangement that allowed for, certainly much less hot conflict. I don't understand why we think that trying to manage integration of these 2 completely different economic and political systems, 2 countries that are adversaries, is somehow a more stable world than one where we actually do decouple, where we do concede each other spheres of influence and accept that we're each kind of going to go our own way to an extent. That strikes me as a much more stable arrangement. Now, that all being said, I think you see in the Trump administration almost an inversion of what you were describing for the Biden administration, Peter, where in this case you have much more consensus on the economic picture, but I think much less clarity on the geopolitical side. And I think a lot of that comes from President Trump himself, who, it's very funny in a sense, he has been too consistent on China. I mean, you can go back to, 30, 40 years ago, his attitude was like, we're getting screwed, we need a better deal. And when he runs for president 2015, 2016, China is screwing us, we need a better deal, was like the almost out of the Overton window hawkish position. And so everyone got like locked in their heads like, oh, Trump is the China hawk. Obviously, they, spent his first term trying to get a deal with China, gets the phase 1 deal that does not resolve a lot of the fundamental issues. Since 2015, over the last 10 years, I think the broader economic thinking, political views in Washington have shifted so far that we just need to get a better deal with China is now the sort of dovish position almost outside the window to the other side. And that, as far as I can tell, that's still exactly where he is. Trump still thinks we're getting screwed by China. We need to get a better deal. And you see him very focused on this idea of like, how do we get a deal with China, such that I think he's really the ultimate China dove within the Trump administration. And so, I think there's a very clear focus economically on this idea of reindustrialization, reshoring, balanced trade that is consistently held and articulated by Trump, by Vance, by Bessent, by Lutnick, by Greer. That's terrific. On the question of what the actual goal, end state status quo with China should be, I don't think we're hearing as nearly as much clarity and what we need to see.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, it does sort of look to me, President Biden, former President Biden, and a bunch of his senior staff, they really saw they saw China as a geopolitical threat, right? Lots of focus on Taiwan, lots of focus on sort of the military strategic issues. And the economics were important, but in many ways were probably, they were important, but were probably less important overall than the strategic issues. Whereas I look at Trump, and to your point, it's very interesting you say that, because I look at him and I can see this view of it is not at all clear to me he sees China as a strategic threat or like a military enemy, right? He clearly sees them as a trading threat and as a country that has been ripping us off for years and years and years. But, he also thinks everyone else has been ripping us off for years and years and years. And so, if you can resolve, I sort of look at him and maybe he thinks, if I can resolve the trade issues with China, and, I'm not as worried about these strategic kind of issues.
Well, and just, I think kind of the two best proof points of this, one is he's still very interested in foreign direct investment from China. Like, even out on the campaign stump last year, you've seen since, he's still well, maybe we should get BYD to come build factories in the United States. And I'm not sure there's anybody else in his administration who likes that idea. But to your point, if this is just about the economics, if there's no geopolitical or strategic concern, we like that Toyota's here, we should get BYD here. And then I think the other place you see this is on the advanced AI chips, where they're sort of, if you guys know the galaxy brain meme, there are these people trying to do this galaxy brain argument where oh, well, if we can get China hooked on the NVIDIA chips, this will ensure, that China adopts an American AI stack. It's literally things people were saying about, moving to China in 1999 as they just woke up and are not aware of any Chinese policy since then. But the actual motivation seems to me is not that galaxy brain argument. It's just well, the goal was to sell more stuff to China. One of the things we're really good at making is advanced AI chips, so we should sell them to China, which again is wrong, but I kind of have more respect for, because at least if you only care about the economic side and you don't think about the geopolitical or strategic side at all, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. And so I think on both these issues, again, you see, just as we were talking about where there were conflicts in the Biden administration, there's obviously very clear, ongoing, robust debate within the Trump administration, not from a bunch of people who aren't sure on their perspective, but from different people with very concrete perspectives. And in a sense, Trump himself is the outlier on some of this at this point.
And I guess the weird thing is, in the Biden administration, when there were disagreements, you just kind of didn't really have any action or decisions. And then in Trump world, when there are disagreements, we just change our mind 3 times a
You
week.
get them all at the same time. Exactly.
Yes, indeed. I'm curious on the chips issue, Oren, because you obviously have been writing quite a bit about this lately. I have to say, from where I sit, having seen that Trump got through his meeting with Xi without seeming to put, without seeing put the high-end NVIDIA chips on the table, I viewed that as a very important development for U.S. national security, and, credit to the team around Trump and to Trump for seeing that we should not be putting our highest end capabilities in the hands of the Chinese, given the kind of intense competition and kind of where we are in the state of the race. I am curious if you think this is going to stick. I have to say, there's a piece of me that's a little bit, worried. It was great in Asia that you didn't do that. Are we going to see Jensen in the Oval Office in another 3 weeks and, some revisiting? And like, how do you think we can make sure this sticks going forward?
I think, Peter, you described the dynamic exactly right, which is there's sort of a live to fight another day element here, where, I don't think this reflects a resolved, finalized, not selling chips to China policy. But, look at the battle by battle level, there was a meeting where that could have gone either way and it went the right way. And that's great. So, that's certainly better than the alternative. I do think more broadly, as we've just been talking about, this is ultimately best understood as one dimension of the larger China discussion. And that's part of the reason, I've become so interested in it. We've been doing a lot of work on it at American Compass, is it is very much the tip of the spear litmus test for how do you think about China? Because it is so clear and discrete. And to your point, like, yes, there's this much broader discussion, like what exactly does decoupling mean? What share of trade are we talking about? How much is it trade versus investment? What does it mean for allies? Like, all of that is super important, but doesn't lend itself as nicely to like a clear pro-con debate in a lot of cases. Yeah. And so I think it's really important to have clear, distinct questions that you can sort of anchor on that make people sort of put their underlying assumptions on the table and say, look, if you believe X, you come out this way on the question. If you believe Y, you come out this other way. And so that's where something like, does it make sense to sell advanced chips to China? Does it make sense to have BYD investing in the US? Are such useful places to focus the policy discussion. On the chip debate, I think it's very much moving in the right direction. I think it's notably a place where you're seeing Congress be somewhat active, even in the face of the Trump administration. I mean, the Gain AI Act, which is, frankly, it's a very narrow policy. All it says is, like, you can't sell advanced chips to China, where there is literally an American company saying, no, please let us buy the chip instead. Even that, the Trump administration, at least initially, but signaled its opposition to. That did not stop Republican senators, Senator Banks, Senator Cotner, the co-sponsors, from saying, like, sorry, we think this is important. It's in the Senate version of the NDAA. And so, that is one very important political dimension to it. I think another is looking at where the tech sector is kind of aligning around this stuff. We all know Jensen at this point, and it is genuinely bizarre to me how far out he and NVIDIA have gone in ways that have just ruined for a generation their credibility as sort of at all interested in either good faith political engagement or the the national interest. If I were a long-term shareholder, I would be very upset that that's the way that they've gone. But you have Jensen trying to sort of talk his book on selling into China, even as he increasingly goes into these arguments that, he, like, to try to make his case, he now has to be out there saying, he actually doesn't even think it matters who wins on AI, or he thinks China's going to win on AI, or, he thinks China wants to be a market country where American companies succeed. Like, the arguments just kind of get increasingly ludicrous in a way that I think makes it harder and harder for Trump, for the administration, to say they're siding there. And you're seeing the rest of the tech sector get pretty fed up with it too. I think it was really notable. You had Palantir's chief technology officer write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, essentially calling Jensen Huang a useful idiot in the pages of the Wall Street Journal.
And then the next week signing a deal with them. So,
right. But so this is then another really good example, right? Palantir signs a deal with NVIDIA, and the way they celebrate it is to say, we're so proud to be working with NVIDIA because NVIDIA's technology is so key to U.S. leadership in the geopolitical competition with China and reindustrialization. Like, it was like such an incredible passive aggressive move. So, and, obviously you have kind of everybody who's scared of NVIDIA because they want NVIDIA chips, but, it was very interesting. You even had Microsoft come out publicly and say they supported the GAIN AI Act. So I think everything has been moving in a good direction on this. I think we are winning in the present tense, the fight. But as Peter noted, and I would acknowledge, you are always one Oval Office meeting and tweet away from heading the other direction. And so, frankly, this is another, as we were talking about back in the broader trade context, this is another argument for Congress to be involved. The question of our export control policy toward China ultimately should be legislated, permanent, and stable. And it is an issue where there is bipartisan agreement, where this is Congress's role, and I think they should make a law.
Two things. First, listeners of the show will have heard many guests who are in favor of strong export controls to China. What is remarkable to me is how hard it has been to find someone to talk the other side of this who isn't, directly financially compensated by firms who would make money. So, it's not for lack of trying for me to get another side of the debate, but it's just, I don't know. If you're out there and you're sharp on this stuff and you want to make the case, send me an email.
Jensen should come on the podcast.
Yeah, let's get Jensen. Jensen will go on any podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Jensen is eager to say foolish things on every podcast. I'm surprised he hasn't called.
I've sent the email, so it's TBD, guys. On the second point, I'm curious for, say you actually have legislation. Does that change the sort of escalation dominance dynamics around this stuff where, if China's trying to undo something, then they can threaten X, and then, Trump will have to tell his commerce secretary, don't do Y. But if it comes out of, if it's in a bill, then it's sort of less easy to negotiate about, or then does China try to threaten, the Senate Commerce Committee, and they get even more pissed and say, go screw yourself. I'm curious how you think this sort of escalation stuff would play out if it was really Congress that took the front role here.
Question, Peter, I'm curious kind of what you think about those dynamics generally these days.
Yeah, so let me offer a couple of thoughts. First on the export controls front, because we're talking GAIN AI, and then maybe coming back to the trade front. I mean, so the way so let me start. I think we, for national security reasons, should not be in the business of offering our most advanced chips to China. And so I actually don't think this is something we should be negotiating over as part of our trade deals. So from my perspective, there's plenty of other things we can negotiate as part of a deal with China. But the idea that Congress would take this particular issue off the negotiating table, I just don't see as I see that as in the U.S. interest rather than against U.S. interest. And in a way, from a negotiating perspective, in a way, I don't know, it kind of cuts both ways from an administration perspective, because on the one hand, they can't offer it, but again, I don't think they should be in the business of offering it. But the flip side is they can just tell the Chinese, gosh, I wish we could talk about this issue, but you know what? I can't, right? So we're going to have to work something else out, right? It changes that negotiating dynamic, but it doesn't necessarily make it an unfavorable negotiating dynamic there. On the trade front, and this is kind of, I think, was a little bit lost, back to the Supreme Court case, a little bit lost in the debate yesterday. I actually think from a negotiating escalation dominance perspective, there is some more flexibility in the other trade statutes than they get credit for. I mean, I look at Trump's first term trade actions on China. And, he used the 301 pretty effectively to like counter escalate when China escalated on the US. And that use of 301 to kind of counter escalate was upheld through the intermediate appellate courts when that got litigated. So I actually think that these other, from a trade negotiating perspective, I think once an administration does its homework, certainly for more competitive and adversarial countries like China to build the sort of regulatory basis for these tariffs, I actually think they would still find these tools to be reasonably effective from a negotiating leverage perspective. It is certainly true, Trump couldn't use a 301 to threaten 10% tariffs because he's ticked off about a TV ad. But on the other hand, that actually shouldn't, he shouldn't be doing that anyway.
Yeah, I think the point about sort of it's good to take things off the table when we in fact don't want them on on the table is exactly right. The one other thing I would just add about the sort of escalation dominance discourse, as it were, is, there's almost a tell in the phrase escalation dominance. Like, it sounds super exciting and cool, and it's what, all the people who in the past would have been planning various wars to start are now really excited to like game out. It's not clear to me that either side here wants to do any of that. I mean, it's a little bit like mutually assured destruction, where I think both sides accept that they can cause massive pain to the other side. It's sort of like who can like shoot the most nuclear weapons at the other side is at some point not an especially important determinant, especially because in this case, I think we're actually moving toward, you can call it a détente if you want, but a situation where both sides actually do kind of want to decouple. I mean, if you believe that the U.S. wants to decouple, then you have that side. China, President Xi's policy for a long time now has been to essentially kind of develop total self-sufficiency, to not to be dependent on anybody, certainly not the United States for anything. And while China certainly enjoys being able to sell lots of stuff to the U.S., one thing we're seeing is that insofar as China's commitment is simply grow manufacturing and export, they have other places they can do that. And longer run, they actually are, much like Germany and Japan, going to have to address their domestic imbalances and domestic consumption. And so it seems to me that both sides kind of want to be at a 40 or 50% tariff with a slow but steady and not too disruptive decoupling. And the rest thus far has proven to be, and I think rationally should be understood as a lot of theater.
Yeah, I don't think that's the right way to characterize the Chinese view. There's a lot of Xi speeches about how he wants to get the world more dependent on China and kind of like having leverage from a sort of like, the Jake Sullivan metaphor was like guns and the bullet to potentially fire. So, the question I think is like, uh, because yes, going from where we are now to 20% or 50% or 80% over the next like 5 to 10 years is not is going to be like uneconomical and costly and like billions of dollars on either side. But I guess the question is like, how much like near term GDP growth, like how much spending are you willing to put on the table in order to kind of have China have less leverage on it? Or is the way you're characterizing this, Oren, that in fact like it's okay for the US to sort of like have these like economic nukes pointed at us? Because I don't know how you follow a lot of the like reciprocity stuff that you were pushing without facing down the enemy getting a vote here.
No, I don't think so at all. And maybe I was a little bit unclear in what I was saying. I think, a huge part of the decoupling is that you in effect disarm those nukes over time. And where you're seeing the U.S. focus first is on, not or alongside the sort of just general shifting of supply chains, things like semiconductors, things like rare earths that, are the immediate concerns. Um, I think the point in my mind is that I don't think the U.S. necessarily wants to or expects to preserve some sort of weapon pointed at China in this respect. Um, and I guess I agree with your point that obviously China would love to have leverage over countries, would love to have the U.S. dependent on it for some of these things. At the end of the day, though, that sort of isn't up to China. I mean, you could, right? Like, China got to do that as long as everybody else was being really stupid. But if the U.S. actually takes seriously the need to rebuild a rare earths capacity, China can't stop it from doing that. I mean, you could, right? Like what would they even look like? I guess it would be China saying like, well, we're going to fire the gun now, essentially, and try to stop you from developing a rare earths capacity by threatening that if you try, we're going to cut off rare earths now. And like, yes, they could cause a lot of pain doing that, but as we've already seen over the last 6 months, even like loading the gun just leads to more rapid commitment to building up the alternative capacity. And in firing the gun, the U.S. has a lot of guns it can fire back. So just like if you actually game it out again, I just don't see an end state. And either from the U.S. policy planning perspective or the China policy planning perspective, I don't see how you could be expecting to plan for a world where you're maintaining that kind of leverage long term. And if you accept you're not going to have it, then the question is, well, what's the path from here to there? Is it worth kind of blowing up a bunch of stuff in both times, on both sides in the meantime? Or would you rather minimize the cost to your own side? And I think both sides are rationally trying to do it in a way that minimizes the cost to their own side.
Peter, do you want to respond to that concluding thought?
I mean, Jordan, my view is much more about Xi's thinking and about Chinese thinking than I do, and I'm very well aware of that. It does seem to me that, while Xi probably does want to keep the world broadly hooked on certain Chinese choke points, he has to be kind of clear-eyed that if the U.S., continues to stay organized the way we have been over the last couple of years, and particularly, frankly, like on rare earths this year, as the Trump administration has gotten very serious about it, like he is going to lose that leverage, at least vis-a-vis the U.S. Maybe the Europeans won't get organized. Like, he might be able to keep that leverage over other partners. I hope not, but he might be. But it just, this strikes me as a solvable problem from our perspective, and she strikes me as not stupid, so he has to be
Yeah.
able to see that coming.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the sort of like what's solvable and what's not solvable. Like, is the world going to recreate the solar kind of like manufacturing ecosystem on the scale that China has, or the EV manufacturing ecosystem on the scale that China has? Perhaps. But like rare earth seems like a much more um like manageable thing. I don't know. We'll see. We're going off into tangents. It's been 75 minutes. Um uh Okay, Peter. So I did listen to 2.5 hours of the Supreme Court. I think this is the first one I've heard in maybe 10 years. And I just have some sort of anthropological observations I'd be curious for both of your thoughts on. Uh, First off, just like refreshing to hear political discourse, which is like sharp and grounded. And, they're sort of like talking about facts. Second, um, I have this new hobby of listening to from podcasts where these like, Orthodox or ultra Orthodox rabbis like give their interpretations about the week's parsha. And every eighth word is in Yiddish or Hebrew. Also, when I listen to Chinese podcasts, I understand like 85% of it. That was kind of what I felt here, where they're just jumping around between all these cases. And you can kind of get the gist, but there is a sort of like level of arcana which is pretty impenetrable. It did feel just odd that we're referencing people from 250 years ago like they really matter today. It's just there are not many other venues in society where like we're going back. I mean, it is kind of rabbinical, right? Where like you care about like Rashi or Rambam, the same way you care about Jefferson or Madison and how they thought about tariffs in like 1802 or what have you. The last thing, like those poor solicitors, man, like this is really stressful. They just get interrupted all the time, and they gotta think quick on their feet. Like there was one moment in there where some judge said like this point doesn't make sense anymore, and after four back and forths, like the government lawyer said like, yeah, I guess so. Okay, let's just move on. I mean, that must like that's a lot, right? It's very like it's like this like theater, like improv. You got to know your stuff incredibly well.
Hopefully you want to watch some more, right? I mean, is this, your future entertainment here? Instead of podcasts, you can listen to Supreme Court oral arguments. No, I just like a couple of reactions to that, Jordan. First of all, I agree with you. Like, it is refreshing to hear a lively debate where you have people, who clearly have an open mind and are grappling through multiple sides of an issue. Like, I actually think this is, what we want our court system to be doing. It did not strike me as kind of particularly partisan or particularly prejudged. That's not to say you couldn't see justices' views coming into the courtroom. Of course you could, but I think you saw justices grappling with in a serious way with the complicated issues in front of them. I agree it's got to be hard for the lawyers arguing these cases. They were all, I'm sure, mooted many times, right? I'm sure they did lots of rehearsal for this. This is not something you sort of wing it going into, but you certainly do have to think on your feet. On the point about history, I mean, that is kind of the way our law works, right? You're trying to build off of precedent. You're trying to think about what the precedents are. You're trying to relate the precedents to to the facts in front. I will say on the kind of the thing that came up that is most historical in that case, and here I'll go a little weedy that you can cut, Jordan, if you want to. The challenge the government has in this case is that, as you heard the Solicitor General concede, there is no other part of American law where the phrase regulate ... importation includes the power to tariff. And there's no other phrase in like American law where regulate by itself includes the power to tariff. And the government's argument is, and it's certainly true, is that, well, back in the 1790s to 1820s, like everyone understood back then importation as including a power to tariff. And so they kind of have to rely on this early historical understanding of that phrase because of the absence of more contemporaneous precedents in support of their position.
One more question for both of you guys. Do the arguments actually matter? I mean, there's hundreds of pages written on all of this. Like, is the quick quip that you have in response, which was only going to be like 150 words anyways, actually going to persuade a judge one way or another?
Well, so I want to ask Peter a related question, if I could jump in, Peter, which is, I agree that oral argument seems majestic and open-minded and the kind of deliberation we want. If this case were being heard 2 years ago about a Biden administration use of IEPA to try to force a global climate agreement, do you think those 9 judges would have simply been asking exactly the reverse set of questions in preparation for voting exactly the opposite way? Or do you think this is how the conversation would have gone?
You would have seen a different lens. Like, I think you would have seen, a shift in the window of the debate there for sure. I actually don't think you would have seen a sort of radical 180, though. I think you probably would have seen the Chief Justice, Justice Roberts, and Amy Coney Barrett being a little bit more skeptical, but they had some skepticism yesterday. And I think you would have seen Kagan and Justice Jackson, more sympathetic to the government. But I think you would have seen them worrying about some of the precedential concerns that we saw Justice Gorsuch asking about yesterday, right? And sort of how this might play out over time. So I do think, it would have been a shift, but I don't think it would have been a 180. To your question, Jordan, on does the oral argument matter? I think probably in many cases it doesn't matter. There are literally, it's not 100, it is literally thousands of pages with all the amicus briefings and everything else in front of the court. But I do think there may be a couple of moments that I could see mattering yesterday. One of them, for example, so the strongest intuitive argument that the government has going for it, not really legal, we can talk about legal, the strongest intuitive argument that the government has going for it is that, well, if IEPA would let President Trump embargo the world, and IEPA, does it, basis of embargoes on Russia and embargoes on Iran. If IEPA would let us embargo the world, why does it not allow a tariff as kind of a lesser, measure? If it would allow an embargo, why doesn't it allow a tariff? And you could see a couple of the justices really trying to grapple with that sort of intuitively very appealing argument. And I think that, what you heard the Oregon lawyer say, you got to laugh in the courtroom, was, well, it's not that the tariff is a donut hole. It's not that there is a hole in this tariff. This is a different kind of pastry, right? And I think that is the kind of thing, like one thing that the justices will have to be persuaded of here if they're not going to read a tariff authority into IEPA, is that the tariff is just different from these other kinds of powers that are in IEPA. I don't know where that will come down, but that debate strikes me as something that actually you could see the justices grappling with it. A couple of them seem open on the question, maybe will matter.
Yeah, so Polymarket had it from 40% down to 20%.
Watching that yesterday, the real time,
wait, in which direction? What's the contract for?
So there were two. I cannot believe Polymarket hasn't started sponsoring ChinaTalk yet. This is actually a little offensive. So will the Supreme Court rule in favor of Trump's tariffs? It was at 40 when the debate started and is now sitting at 25. And then there's another market. Will the court force Trump to refund the tariffs, which started at 8 and is now up to 16? So I think we'll call it there. This was very fun. Thank you, too, for being a part of ChinaTalk.
This was great. Thank you.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Oh yes, Washington, D.C., 10:04. 2 dockets on the board, let the arguments roll. We got a world on fire, deficits and fentanyl flood. IEPA's a wrench when the system needs a stud. Regulate importation, that's the language in play. Youngstown's on one when Congress clears the way. Not a tax, it's a tool, foreign commerce on tap. Tariffs are regulatory, revenues just a slap. Nixon did it once, Yoshida held the line. Dames and Moore says emergencies need room to grind. Just nullify, void block verbs on a shelf. But where's tariff in the statute text itself? Is it regulate or tax? When the crisis hits, by means of licenses or otherwise legit, major questions banging on the courthouse door. Article I, Article 2, who gets the score? Quotas, embargoes, fees with a price. If nobody pays, is it still a vice? Regulate or tax? Draw the line in the sky in an unusual threat. How high can you fly? Sotomayor. If it walks like a tax, hits pockets like a tax, then call it what it is, don't dress it in slacks. Cagon in Title 19, Congress spells duties out. Here it just says regulate, that's doubt. Barrett, show me where regulate importation means duties before. Besides Yoshida's gloss, got anything more? Alatul, there's section 338, MFN's old sword. And Algonquin said a just can be a monetary court. Gorsuch, if foreign affairs are the ticket to ride, can Congress hand over the whole highway divide? Jackson, the history read, freeze transactions in war. IEPA's a sanctions bust, not a tax superstore. License as a a noun, fee as a scheme. I told that looks like tariff, same team or just a meme. Is it regulate or tax when the crisis hits? By means of licenses or otherwise legit? Major questions banging on the courthouse door. Article I, Article 2, who gets the score? Quotas, embargoes, fees with a price. If nobody pays, is it still a vice? Regulate or tax? Draw the line in the sky in an unusual threat. How high can you fly? Tariffs or taxes, that's Civics 101. Congress holds the purse till the job is done. No one-way ratchet, once you give it, it stays. No guardrails, no ceilings, just executive plays. Title 19's got caps, 15, 150 days. IEPA skips the limits, takes the freeways. Call it climate, call it cars, call it anything you want. Major question says read the text, don't front. A license ain't a levy, an embargo ain't a till. Control is the purpose, not the treasury's fill. You can shut the port completely, sure that's raw, but taxing is different, it's the people's law. Donut hole? Nah, different pastry class. Embargo's a break, a tariff's cash. Emergencies don't erase Article I. If you want to tax power, write it, son. Robert's foreign facing maybe, but the bill lands here. Who pays the tariff when it shifts the gear? Gorsuch Congress gives with a pen, needs 2/3 to reclaim. Be careful what you delegate in the people's name. Regulate importation, broad or narrow seam. By instructions, by license, or otherwise it seems. Algonquin whispered, a just can ring his fees, but legislative history's a fickle breeze. Young Stones chorus, balance under stress. Curtis Wright footnotes say foreign gets a flex. Yeah, J.W. Hampton still hums in the back. Delegations need principles, keep the rails on track. Is it regulate or tax when the crisis hits? By means of licenses or otherwise legit? Major questions pounding, who owns the key? Article I's ledger or Article 2C? Quotas, embargoes, leverage for deals. If no dime is raised, do we bless those wheels? Regulate or tax? Sing the line clear and true. If it's revenue power, it belongs to the two. The clock reads 12:44, the echo's cool. Submitted says the chief gavel as a metronome tool. Official subject to final review. Till the slip opinion drops, the hook stays on you.